Good evening and welcome to June's Project You Academy Nutritional Therapy webinar. That was a bit of a mouthful. So this month I decided that I wanted to do a webinar on tics, Tourettes, and the nervous system. And it's one that's kind of personally, well, it's a webinar, it's a subject that's quite personal to me. You can probably see in the kind of corner camera, and if you know me in real life, I tic, okay, I tic. Sometimes the tics are worse than other times. Most of the time, I have a facial tic and I tic. Sometimes I have more general tics. I am going to just put my fan on because it is already hot. And I'm hoping you cannot hear it. I'm hoping the noise cancellation in the background is working. Okay. So let's get to it. So before we begin, like every month, it's important to understand that this webinar is for educational purposes only. It does not constitute as medical advice. Always consult a qualified health professional for personal health concerns. Your journey in understanding your body, your mind, and symptoms is essential, and we aim to equip you with valuable insights and knowledge, right? We're not here to treat you. I'm not here to diagnose you. I'm here to say, hey, this is a subject that I'm interested in. This is a subject that comes up with a lot of the clients that we work with at ProjectYOU and some of the clients that I work with in my own nutritional practice. Let's make some space to talk about it, to think about it, to kind of share stories, to ask questions, to be curious, right? I am not an expert in this particular subject. I am kind of a specialist within the nervous system and I have lived experience of tics. I do work with clients that have been diagnosed with Tourette's syndrome, and I have friends that have Tourette's syndrome. So it's within my world, but I am also very open to get kind of being challenged on things or being told, hey, I think you got that a little bit wrong, or hey, maybe that information's a little bit outdated. Feel free to put comments in the chat, in the questions, in the comments below, however we want to do this. It's a democracy here, right? It's not a dictatorship. So one thing I will say about this webinar today, I am going to put a trigger warning on it because I do think some of the subjects that we speak about are a little bit sensitive, and towards the second half of the webinar today, I will talk a little bit about the relationship between trauma, Tourette's and tics, and just nervous system health as well. So again, just kind of experience this webinar however you wish to. If you want to kind of go, kind of stop, pause, come back to it, or kind of if you're watching live, if you want to kind of take 5 minutes out, kind of come back, or not engage and just be behind the screen, all these things are fine. It's about how best you kind of engage with the material. Okay. And for those of you who are watching live, you will get the recording afterwards, and you will get the slides within the kind of ProjectYOU fitness app as well. So you'll see me there either this evening or tomorrow morning. All right, so who am I? That's a bit of a blurry photo. Maybe I'll fix that for next time. So my name is Whitney Isles. I am the nutritional therapist with ProjectYOU Academy. I'm BANT registered and I'm also trauma informed. So I have a trauma-informed approach to health. This is because of my kind of work before becoming a nutritional therapist was very much kind of centered around trauma, working with people with complex trauma, working with professionals who support people with complex trauma. It's the thing that I'm very interested in life, from a professional perspective, but also from a lived experience perspective. And with kind of ProjectYOU and with my kind of outside of ProjectYOU practice, I specialize in working with neurodivergent women. I'm very interested in how we kind of understand our bodies, our health, without being overwhelmed by that. And I do a lot of one-to-one work to make sense of kind of very kind of complex and interconnected symptoms at a place that kind of works well for them or for you if you're watching this and you're one of my clients. I'm also a neurodivergent woman. These things all ring true to me as well. So I'm kind of taking up that space as professional, as well as kind of this is part of my kind of lived experience, my personal experience as well. So some of the things that we will cover today, I really like to kind of bring social justice work into all of my work as well. So you'll see it intertwined in today's webinar. So throughout the whole hour, we'll be thinking about kind of who gets believed, who gets funding, who gets studied. And for anyone whose body has done something they could not kind of explain or control or were dismissed, we're thinking about kind of why neurodivergent women are so kind of often last to be seen when we're thinking of these topics. And we're going to have a look obviously at tics, Tourette's and the nervous system together, and kind of, just again to say that this is about education. This is not about diagnosis. I'm not qualified to diagnose anyone, and I definitely would not do that over a webinar, even if I was. So let's think about tics. Okay, so let's start with the basics. A tic is a sudden, fast, repeated movement or sound that the body produces without conscious intent. Okay, so it's completely involuntary. So these can include things like blinks, like I do, head jerks, shoulder shrugs, or facial grimaces. Um, it's really interesting that whenever I start talking about tics or anything like this, or I'm around other people that tic, I feel like my body tries to do it more. I don't know kind of what happens there. So there could also be sound tics, a sniff, a throat clear, a small noise, a short, sharp sound. And these can easily be mistaken or missed for a habit or a nervous gesture. They are the key feature is that tics are involuntary. This is what sets them apart from habits, fidgets, and everyday nerves. The person is not choosing to do it, and they often cannot simply stop on command. Some people can suppress tics, but it's important to understand that actually there is a cost to suppressing tics, right? It might mean that after you try to suppress it, you could be very exhausted. It's very tiring. It takes up a lot of energy. It might mean that your kind of concentration isn't there for other things. And it also might mean that once you kind of come out of the environment where you're suppressing tics, then those tics might exacerbate because they feel like they have to kind of come out. I know that when kind of people start to mention my tics and talk to me about my tics, that's like they exacerbate. And even when I'm trying to like hold them in, it's like, nah, that's not going to happen. Or I try to hold them in and they're going to come out at some point throughout the day, right? Two ways we can sort tics, okay? And it's important to kind of understand these different categories. So we have motor tics, which are movements of the body, vocal or phonic tics, which are sounds made by the voice, and both can occur in the same person and shift over time. It's not an either or thing. Someone can experience both of these things. So simple tics are brief and they involve just kind of one small area of the body, such as a single blink, a shoulder shrug, a sniff, or a clear of the throat, and they're quick and contained. Whereas complex tics are longer in duration and involve coordinated sequences across more than one muscle group. So they can look almost kind of purposeful or intentional, which is part of why they're so often kind of misunderstood and misread by others. And it's really important to understand that when we're thinking about tics, they're not a choice, right? And the difference between a simple and a complex tic describes the movement and not the person experiencing it, okay? So these are important things to understand. So some of the names that you might have heard, I know that there was a lot of controversy around tics recently in the media due to an award show. That happened recently that had someone who was there kind of ticking in the audience, and they said a racial slur as they were ticking when there were kind of two black men up on the stage, and that kind of created all of this discourse online in relation to kind of how to kind of deal with Tourette's and tics in kind of public spaces. Where's the kind of this surface going on, kind of there was all of this kind of debate around, sorry, my cat is now walking across the screen, and there was all this debate around kind of, is this kind of voluntary, why are these slurs, why is this language within someone's kind of vocabulary in the first place? But it's really important to understand that this is all involuntary. This is not kind of people kind of people's inner worlds, in that sense, their inner beliefs, their inner kind of thoughts and feelings kind of come into the surface. Tics and Tourette's, when we're thinking about kind of the involuntary kind of vocalization of swearing and offensive and socially inappropriate words or phrases, this tends to be very misunderstood as something's kind of, this person's racist if they say a racist word, when actually these words are within our kind of social vocabulary, which means that they're in the mind, which means that they can come up and come out through something called copulalia. These are going to be fun words to say. Okay, but it's important to understand that if you do hear someone who's ticking inappropriate kind of an offensive words or swearing, again, these are completely involuntary and they're not around kind of how what this person's internal beliefs are. Okay, We also have coperaxia, so the involuntary performance of rude and obscene and socially inappropriate gestures. So again, like coprolalia, it's kind of not chosen and it is not a reflection of a person's values or intentions, right? Then we have echolalia and echopraxia. So this is the involuntary repetition of words or phrases spoken by others. Really funny if you ever see me and Leanne together, because this this can happen. This can happen. And again, echopraxia is the involuntary copying or mirroring of other person's movements, and both can kind of occur also in Tourette's and autism. And palilalia, the involuntary repetition of one's own words, phrases, or sounds, often with increasing speed or decreasing volume. It can occur mid-sentence and is distressing to experience, right? So sometimes I think, there's this kind of misunderstanding that, oh, some of these things are happening and that person experiencing it is just kind of used to it, but actually they can be very stressful. It can be a very stressful experience, and it's not just the experience itself of the ticking of like the motor tics or the vocal tics. It's also the stress from how the external world then experiences the person ticking, and the kind of the projections that they then receive. Oh, you're inappropriate, you shouldn't be around kids, you shouldn't be out in public. All of these things add to the kind of negative experience of ticking or having Tourette's. It's about the experience of having those tics themselves, but also how then do you get to move around the world? How are you seen by others? How are you kind of related to by others? And a lot of the kind of misrepresentation when it comes to tics and Tourette's plays a part of kind of people's experiences, right? Or kind of, I remember like I've had before that, people have said to me, oh, you tic more when you're socially anxious. And I'm thinking, this is nothing to do with social anxiety. This is because the lights are really bright, and this is because there's so much kind of sensory input. So there's a lot of kind of people feel like they can diagnose you, and people feel like they kind of know best when you're ticking and what your tics mean. So there's a lot of kind of there's a lot of other people's interpretations of them, and there's a lot of misinformation around them. And like I said kind of previously, I can't remember which award show it was. I know it was ones to do with movies, but we saw like the public discourse and a lot of the kind of the misunderstanding, although there was some kind of really useful discourse that kind of came out of that in relation to kind of how to better support people with Tourette's or people that do tic, especially vocally tic, kind of in public spaces, and where does the accountability kind of stand, right? I think there was some kind of really useful dialogue. My friend Professor Nancy Doyle wrote a really good piece in Forbes magazine around that. So we can also think about the kind of family of tic disorders. So we have provisional tic disorders, which are kind of tics are present, but have been happening for less than 1 year. This is often the first diagnosis given when tics are new or emerging. We have persistent or chronic tic disorder. So again, this is when it's a little bit kind of longer. So either the motor tics or the vocal tics, but not both. Have been present for more than 1 year. This is a long-term condition, even though it does not meet the kind of full Tourette's definition. And then we have Tourette's syndrome, which is where you have both the motor and the vocal tics present, right? So the persistent and chronic tic disorder is either or, so it's motor tics or vocal tics, whereas Tourette's would be classed under kind of both the vocal tics and the motor tics. Tourette's is the most kind of well known, but is not the most common tic disorder. Leanne, I am going to just quickly put you on the panel, just in case Kratos decides to unplug my computer, which he did within the week. So if we go offline, we won't all go offline. Okay, so is there more than one type of Tourette's, right? So formally, no. It's not like Tourette's has all of these different kind of subcategories. It's either you kind of meet the full kind of definition and diagnosis of Tourette's, or you have a tic disorder. That's the clear criteria. There's no kind of official subtype. in real life, this is going to look different to person, right? Two people with the same diagnosis can have entirely different tick types, different kind of frequencies of tics, different severities, different impact on daily life. The label is same, but the lived experience can be quite kind of very different, right? And that's also going to kind of be thinking about when we kind of think about, well, what are the resources that they have access to? Where are they growing up? What does it mean when they tick and they're out in public? Are they perceived as dangerous? Are they perceived as, uh kind of strange and weird, and kind of, do they get access to therapy? Do they get access to medication? Do they get access to kind of interventions and the things that they need, right? All of these things are going to also play into that lived experience. So it's not just, again, going to be the internal experience of Tourette's or tics, it's going to be the external experience of Tourette's and tics. So the other thing that we have to think about as well is, for the majority of people with Tourette's and tics, so the majority of people with Tourette's, the tics might not even be the hardest part. There might be loads of co-occurring conditions that are going along with that, things like OCD, ADHD, or both. And these again kind of shape the day-to-day experience of tics and Tourette's, right? It tends to not be just Tourette's, or it tends to not be just tics. It tends to be kind of other things and co-occurring conditions going on. Like we say in all of these webinars, right? It's never just the one thing. Being neurodivergent tends to be, we have these clusters of co-occurring conditions, whether that's also kind of EDS, MCAS, dysautonomia, POTS, there's fibromyalgia, all of these other things that kind of make us us, right? And for each of us, those clusters are going to be kind of slightly different. So why do tics happen? So tics are not random, and they're not a choice. They arise from specific brain circuits and neurological processes that neurodivergent women are very rarely given a clear explanation of. I say neurodivergent women because that's what our client group is. Within Project You, or the majority of our client group, it doesn't mean that it's not kind of true for kind of those who do not identify as neurodivergent women, right? So understanding the mechanics behind tics can genuinely be valid and kind of practically useful. So some neuroscience, I'm not going to get too deep into the neuroscience. So the brain circuits kind of as gates, right? So our brains have these kind of circuits that act like gates, and they filter which movements and sounds are allowed to kind of go through as actions, right? And in most people, these gates, we can think about it, they kind of hold firm. Within a tic condition, these gates can be a little bit leaky, and they can let movements slip through, which are kind of not consciously chosen. Dopamine is part of the picture. So the dopamine system plays a significant role in tic conditions. So dopamine influences how strong those gate circuits fire, which why many tic medications work by adjusting kind of dopamine signaling in the brain, right? And you could also have a very interesting kind of conversation, or go down the rabbit hole in relation to like kind of dopamine pathways and Parkinson's, right? And dopamine pathways and schizophrenia. We tend to think about dopamine in relation to ADHD, which tends to be a kind of decrease in dopamine, if we want to kind of think about it kind of just more simplicity, in a more simplistic, simplified term, words, right? But when we're thinking about things like tics, when we're thinking about kind of Parkinson's and schizophrenia, we're thinking kind of almost kind of too much dopamine, right? And the dopamine needs to be turned down a little bit. But this is why, again, we see like the tremors with Parkinson's as well. So this dopamine pathway, I think, kind of within the neurodivergent kind of realms, we oversimplify it in a lot of ways, but we also kind of tend to only think about it through the lens of ADHD, when actually kind of dopamine is part of like such a bigger picture in relation to kind of neurodivergence and kind of other diagnoses, other conditions that we would consider under that kind of neurodivergent umbrella, like schizophrenia, for example. So when we can think about tics, we think about this kind of this urge, this kind of build up, this physical sensation. It's like a pressure, a discomfort, until the tic releases. And you can kind of think about it as, when you want to sneeze, and you can feel the sneeze coming up, and you're like, oh, stop, I'm gonna sneeze, right? It's that same kind of build up. You can kind of feel the tics kind of building up in your body. And I say that as, also someone with the lived experience of someone who ticks, I tend to feel mine kind of building up in my legs, and I'm like, oh, we're about to have a tick attack. Like, you can feel it. And kind of, I was saying this kind of previously, some of us are able to suppress our tics, but suppressing tics, it would be like trying to suppress a sneeze, right? It comes at great effort, at great energy, and can have an impact on the body, right? If we're trying to suppress something that's kind of wanting to naturally happen, it can make us feel very fatigued and very tired afterwards. Or kind of we might leave the situation where we're trying to suppress and then have a kind of what I always refer to as this tick attack, where all the kind of tics come at once because they've just built up in your system, right? So stress and sensory load and hormonal shifts all turn tics up. Equally, tics naturally cycle over time, appearing more intensely in some periods and more kind of quietly in others. It's important to understand that the kind of the inconsistency is very typical, and it's not something to be kind of treated suspiciously. So I think kind of one of the things, and I was saying this earlier, I think whenever we talk about these kind of subjects, it's really important to bring the kind of wider kind of social justice aspects into the work that we do, because they do play a huge part in kind of who gets treated, how many of us kind of get access to medication, how many of us get access to the right doctors and specialists, and how we're just treated. Are we treated with our kind of one symptom over there, one symptom over here, one condition there, one condition there, or are we kind of looked at as a whole, right? So whenever we do this kind of work, whenever we're thinking about education, we have to be thinking through the lens of social justice. What are some of the systems, what's wrong with some of the systems, and what some of these systems that need to be changed, right? So the interesting thing around kind of Tourette's syndrome and kind of autism, both are neurodevelopmental conditions, right? They arise from differences in how the brain develops. It's not about damage, it's not about disease, it's about difference, right? And they overlap, and understanding how they relate can help us explain why so many kind of neurodivergent women carry more than one diagnosis or kind of go unrecognized for both, right? So Tourette's and autism kind of both emerge in childhood and are involved in kind of different kind of brain wiring. Neither is a mental illness, a behavior choice, or something caused by parenting, right? Or trauma. I've got a webinar kind of next month on this whole, autism and ADHD is caused by trauma. Oh, it drives me nuts. So the interesting thing here, right? The interesting thing with Tourette's and autism, when we're thinking about children, okay, so it's slightly different in adult populations, but when we're thinking about children, kind of Tourette's and autism affects roughly 1 in 100 children, right? So if you were looking at the stats for autism, it kind of marks around the kind of 1 in 100 children. If you think about the stats for Tourette's, is 1 in 100 children, right? The stats start to kind of differ in adulthood, but both are kind of far more common than most people realize, right? And there's a lot of work being done around kind of autism awareness. And the interesting thing is, we can see how close they are, especially when we think about children, in relation to the data. But Tourette's or Tourette's syndrome and tics don't get enough funding, don't get enough kind of research and data and that kind of campaigns kind of going on. It's starting to get better, and we've had some really kind of good films out lately in order to build kind of have that recognition, do the campaigning and do that kind of stuff. But it's important to understand, there's a difference here in how these things are thought about by society as a whole. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but these things are important, right? So both of these conditions are diagnosed far more in boys, right? And we know that the research is constantly shows boys are diagnosed with both conditions at much higher rates. But this is not because girls and women don't have autism, don't have Tourette's, but because the diagnostic criteria and the clinicians using them were built around male presentations, right? And the tics and autistic stereotypes, types. What did I write there? There is an I in there that shouldn't be in there. Can look alike, or maybe it should be in there, who knows? These kind of repetitive movements appear in both conditions. So that could be a hand flap, a rocking motion, a repeat sound. These could be a tic, a stim, or both at once, and they can be generally hard to tell apart. but the different matters less than understanding the person in front of you. The overlap between autistic people is estimated kind of to like 22 to 33%, kind of dependent on the research that you read, have a tic disorder. So 22 to 33% of autistic people have a tic disorder, and about kind of anywhere between 4.8 and 12% of autistic people meeting the criteria for Tourette's, and 9.12% kind of meeting the criteria for a chronic tic disorder, right? So we can see, you know, when we're thinking about autistic people that have a tic disorder, you're looking at anywhere between kind of a quarter to a third of autistic people, right? That's what the data says at the moment, right? But when we look at where the kind of research money actually goes, this is what I was saying earlier, there's this kind of starker picture that emerges, right? So Tourette syndrome is one of the most underfunded neurodevelopmental conditions. The gap between what is spent and how many people are affected is not a small oversight. It's a pattern that tells us whose suffering is taken and who's not, right? Or whose suffering is taken seriously and who's not, right? So where we think about kind of funding for autism research, this kind of goes into the hundreds of millions of pounds, right, or dollars, right? We have large institutions, or we have dedicated institutions, large scale longitude studies, and kind of growing public awareness. But when we start to think about kind of dedicated Tourette's funding, it's still very, very kind of low, right? Even when we can kind of think about kind of the millions globally, it's a fraction of the total. And especially when we're starting to think about kind of larger studies or kind of specialist centers, again, you know, it kind of shrinks in comparisons to when we think about kind of autism research. And we need research around autism, right? We need that. It helps, it supports. But even when we think about kind of research around kind of being autistic, we're still not there yet, you know, we're still not there yet. If we were there yet, you know, we'd be getting our diagnosis is a lot easier. We'd be getting the right support. We'd be getting our needs met, right? So even when we think about kind of what's happening kind of in the realms of autism, you know, when we think about kind of Tourette's, there is a huge difference, right? So less funding means fewer specialists, longer waits, and more people, especially women, are kind of going undiagnosed for years. So again, we can think about the kind of diagnostic gap. So around 61% of females with Tourette's receive a diagnosis compared to 77% of males. Women are roughly half as likely to be diagnosed at all. And when they are getting diagnosed, they're waiting for approximately a year longer than men. Girls and women often experience more severe symptoms as they move into adulthood. So again, this will be around kind of puberty and hormones and kind of the hormonal changes and how they kind of affect tics and Tourette's, right? So this is not just about kind of women having Tourette's kind of less often when we think about the data, and the data is more skewed towards men. This is about a system that's kind of not built to recognize how it presents in women and how it's not corrected. And again, I'd like to kind of go deeper into research around, we know that as kind of women and girls, we mask a lot more. We kind of we suppress ourselves a lot more within our social situations. Do we do the same things with tics and Tourette's in a way that kind of often can do us harm, right? If we're ticking at school, you know, are we doing things to suppress that? Are there kind of drug habits going on in the background in order to help kind of suppress tics and Tourette's? And how are they being seen? How are they being perceived? Are girls being seen as kind of just being more disruptive? And, you know, I'd be really interested in kind of what's happening in like secondary school in relation to kind of tics and Tourette's, because unless you're kind of in the right social media kind of algorithms, I don't think we really see what it looks like for kind of younger girls to have tics and Tourette's, right? I know that kind of I rarely see it, and it's only when I hit the right algorithms that it kind of comes up. And then kind of when we start to think about intersectionality, because we should always be thinking about intersectionality, we're thinking about, again, who are these kind of studies kind of built on? And they tend to be built on kind of white, wealthier, kind of the upper class or middle class, kind of people who have access to the clinics, right? People have an access to be kind of represented in these spaces. So we were always thinking about kind of where does the research take place? Who is accessing the clinics that will be kind of part of the research? How is this research base being kind of developed? So again, English speaking populations, people with time, people with money, people who kind of get through the door, people who are able to be thought about. Who's being undiagnosed? Again, we can be thinking about kind of Black and brown communities. We can be thinking about working class communities. We can be thinking about kind of migrant communities. Where are the gaps in the research, right? We should always, whenever we're thinking about things, thinking about where are the gaps, who's not being represented. Okay. So kind of moving on a little bit from kind of tics and Tourette's and kind of thinking about some of the other kind of disorders out there that I want to bring a little bit of light to. So it's important to understand that kind of tics can suddenly appear overnight, and they can kind of appear along a flood of anxiety, of OCD, of emotional dysregulation. When this happens, it's not imagined, it's not a coincidence, it's a signal that the nervous system has been disrupted and it deserves more than a single explanation. So some of the things that I kind of like to follow that I'm interested in, but again, I'm not a huge expert in these areas, is things like PANDAS and PANS. So pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorders associated with strep infections. So again, tics and OCD symptoms can appear or dramatically worsen following a strep infection. And it's the immune system is kind of confused by the infection and mistaken and targets the brain tissue. And again, PANS, so pediatric acute onset neuropsychiatric syndrome. So it's again the broader version of PANDAS, sudden onset of OCD, tics, or emotional dysregulation triggered by kind of infections, environmental causes that are not strep. I think Lyme disease is a big one there, and Lyme disease and how it can affect and inflame the brain. So when we're thinking about kind of conditions, so infectious or environmental conditions, we're thinking about things that can inflame the brain. And I'm pretty sure it's more around like the brain stem and the basal ganglia, if you want to kind of get a little bit more in depth in that, right? So again, not researched enough, especially kind of some of the more severe cases need a lot more research, need a lot more resources. And there's a lot of, especially children and young adults really suffering from, how severe their tics can be, and also kind of being misdiagnosed. And I think the misdiagnosis is a big one, because these children can go for a very long time. And I say children because that's where I've seen a kind of a lot of the research and a lot of the kind of lived experience, getting misdiagnosed with the wrong thing. So getting misdiagnosed with PANDAS when actually it might have been Lyme disease and they've been bitten by a tick, and all of these other things kind of going on, right? So another thing that we can think about is this kind of the bodily connection. And me, I'm always going to speak about hypermobility. I'm always going to speak about EDS and dysautonomia because it affects so many of us, right? So I think it's important to understand that kind of when we're thinking about kind of hypermobility spectrum disorder, when we're thinking about hypermobility EDS, this is a connective tissue disorder, and it's kind of more than just the bendy joints, right? It's going to have an impact throughout our whole system. It's wide reaching. And we also know that hypermobility kind of it frequently kind of works alongside dysautonomia, right? So dysautonomia, as we've said before, it involves the autonomic nervous system, right? The autonomic nervous system is the part of our nervous system that is responsible for all the involuntary stuff, right? The dysautonomia was probably why many of us could not regulate our temperature last week. It was hot, it was horrible. I did not like it. My body didn't like it. My nervous system didn't like it. You guys can't see, but my cat is currently like sprawled across my desk. I'm going to take a quick picture and I'm going to give it to, use like that part of ProjectYOU afterwards, so you can see what I'm dealing with down here. So yeah, I wanted to kind of make sure that we're also kind of thinking about tics and Tourette's through this lens of, oh, let me do that again. Oh, he leaned on the keyboard, guys. I'm sorry. Start that again. So I always want to bring things back to kind of hypermobility, dysautonomia kind of parts because it affects so many of us. And there is such kind of so much kind of overlap between kind of tics and kind of connective tissue and dysautonomia, right? So this is not a coincidence, right? The autonomic nervous system is genuinely involved in Tourette's and tic conditions, and connective tissue instability can turn up the volume kind of on these signals and trigger more tics, right? So we know that when we're kind of feeling unstable in our body, that can kind of trigger our dysautonomia and our amygdala to kind of see this as this instability as a lack of safety and put us into a state of fight or flight, and that fight or flight can then have an impact on our nervous system. And for those of us who have Tourette's and for those of us who tic, can turn up the volume of our tics and our triggers. So this is how kind of the fitness journey all kind of plays into kind of how we think about Tourette's and tics as well. So we're also thinking about, you know, are you hypermobile? Do you have POTS? Do you have dysautonomia? And how can we work with all of these conditions together rather than trying to separate them into to different kind of buckets, that one over there, that one over there. A revved up body kind of has these leaky gates. So again, this kind of heightened state, which is common in dysautonomia and hypermobility, can kind of affect the brain circuits that filter these movements, and they have like less capacity to suppress these tics as well. We have this heightened interoception. So hypermobility anyway kind of comes with this louder internal sensation. So feeling the body from the inside out more intensely than most people do. So again, that kind of links into like our chronic pain and kind of how we might have sensitivities within our nervous system. And this kind of louder internal sensation, the stronger these urges, and the stronger the urges, the harder the tic is to reset or delay, right? So again, it's the harder it might be to suppress. I wanted to put this in here. Okay, I'm gonna be honest with you. I'm gonna be honest with you. It is part of, you know, because it affects me. I want to put it in there just to see if anyone watches this and goes, hey, this rings true to me, because this is something that no optician has ever been able to tell me about. But the more I get into EDS forums, the more I get into understanding connective tissue and dysautonomia, the more I start to understand where my tics and my facial tics are kind of coming from as well, right? So I think I wanted to kind of put this in here, a little bit for me, a little bit for you. We'll blend it together, right? So sometimes a single pair of eyes can show exactly kind of how connective tissue and the nervous system and tics are connected. So in EDS, the tear glands are affected by hypermobile connective tissue, making dry, gritty eyes kind of very common, right? So I was always told you have dry eyes, you have really dry eyes, but and your tear glands are blocked, but no one could tell me actually what the reasoning for this was. So this irritation creates a sensation, and the sensation becomes an urge. So each link in this chain is supported by evidence. Joining them is a clinical reason, not a final diagnosis, right? So this kind of we know that with EDS, one of the things that can be affected is our glands, especially our tear glands. So many of us will have these kind of dry eyes. This irritation can easily become like an urge, and this urge means that we can blink a lot more, and this kind of building up to tics. So my tics kind of get worse and get better and get worse and get better, but there are all of these kind of other factors to them. So a blink can also be a release. A blink becomes that kind of release of that urge. And what looks like a simple eye tic may be rooted in a real physical discomfort that the nervous system is responding to. So the line between a dry eye blink and a tic blink can genuinely be very blurry. See what I did there? It can be both at once. So treating the dry eye may reduce the urge. It does not mean that the tic was not real, right? So I think this is a very kind of beautiful way of kind of showing that how, you know, these things are complicated and they can have kind of dual kind of roots, right? It's not necessarily one thing or the other thing, but one thing can affect the other thing, if that makes sense. FND is another one when we can start to think about kind of nervous system health. I'm really running out of time. We might go a little bit over. We're just going to edit it. We're just going to edit it afterwards. It's fine. So the thing with FND, so it can be kind of a bit more of an umbrella diagnosis a lot of the time as well. If you think about it kind of it's the software, not the hardware, right? So the symptoms are very real, they're very involuntary, and they can be profoundly disabling. So again, we could be thinking about tics, we could be thinking about kind of functional seizures, that there's a lot of kind of symptoms that go under there, but it's not anything wrong, structurally wrong with the brain, or not anything that can be visible on scans, which is why it's so often kind of mis or disbelieved, right? And everyone kind of, there's a bit of this thing where they go, well, you got FND, that's more psychological, right? It's a psychosymptomatic kind of thing. But and it tends to be because the kind of structural damage can't always be found on the scans, right? But actually it doesn't make it any less real. It's not a kind of a fake kind of disorder. It's very real, it has very real consequences, it has very real symptoms attached to it, right? It's one of the kind of most common diagnoses in neurological clinics, and is disappropriately affects women in their 20s and 30s. If we had more time, I'd go into it a little bit more deeper, because I do think it is like such a big subject that we could spend a lot of time talking about. I think it is important for us as neurological women, as neurodivergent women, because we already have these kind of sensitive systems that are running on a higher load. We're managing a lot of sensory input, we're managing our masking, we're managing our dysregulation, we're having to manage kind of navigating society and all of these additional things. And so we have like this lesser capacity to absorb additional stress, because we're, if we're already operating on 60 or 70 or 80, it can really make this kind of FND kind of more likely, but also kind of more harder to untangle. Again, a little bit of history, a little bit of feminism put into here, because it's got to be done, guys. It's got to be done, right? So we can think also about the kind of functional and dissociative seizures. Again, seizures are a big subject, huge subject. Epilepsy, again, another day. But it's important to understand that functional and dissociative seizures can look like epilepsy, but they come from a kind of a different, but they do not come from the same kind of electrical activity in the brain. So they're not epilepsy. They tend to be like kind of considered non-epileptic seizures, right? But they are still real. They are still an involuntary response from a nervous system that has reached overwhelm, right? And I think these things are important to understand, especially for us as women, if we're kind of more affected by these things. There is a history in medicine, right? There is a history in medicine. There's a really good book I'm going to look up there. It's called Unwell Women. And it talks about kind of how women were treated within the kind of the medical institution for many, many years, right? And, a lot of the kind of how women are treated in medicine, in psychiatry, comes from a lot of the work around hysteria. And hysteria, so the word hysteria kind of is rooted in the Greek word for womb. And when I say, you're not even going to believe me, because it's wild that doctors used to come in and they would say, oh, this woman is kind of going through what she's going through because her womb has moved. Her womb is in her throat, or her womb is in her chest. And this was actually like the diagnostic criteria, that the woman's womb was moving, and that's why she had a functional seizure, right? Like this kind of this lack of belief. Again, you could read another good book would be Trauma and Recovery. I think it's Judith Herman Lewis. And again, she goes into the roots of kind of Freud and kind of where the kind of psychiatric diagnosis of hysteria came from. And a lot of it is rooted in, trigger warning here, I'm going to talk about some sensitive stuff. A lot of it is rooted in kind of sexual abuse and how much sexual abuse was going on. And Freud realized actually a lot of the psychological symptoms that women were experiencing were coming from the sexual abuse that they were kind of victim of in the home. But because of the pressure of society at the time, he made a conscious decision to not speak up on the amount of sexual abuse that was going on, and just label women with hysteria, and say, again, this is their womb wandering, this is, oh, these weird women, these, they're unwell, they just, they just need to be locked away. So when we're kind of going through the medical system now, when we're not being believed, when we're not being researched enough, when we're not kind of, being truly understood, and our whole system's not being truly understood, it's really important to understand that there is a very dark history behind that we are still kind of working to catch up on in relation to kind of being seen and being heard, right? So when we start to think about things like kind of functional or dissociative seizures, when we start to think about our nervous systems and how they react and how they can be sensitive, and kind of how we've sustained trauma and sensory overload and how we deal with stress, they're still part of a system that is not seeing us, not hearing us. And it's important that kind of whenever we do this kind of work, whenever we do these kind of education spaces, we bring that to light and we make sure that that is seen, because that's part of the pushback. That's part of us kind of getting our needs met. Yeah, we have to speak up and be that voice. So trauma, stress, and tics, what do we actually know? So it's really important to understand that trauma does not cause Tourette's. It is, Tourette's is a highly heritable developmental condition, but stress and trauma can shape it powerfully, right? It can shape how severe it is, how it feels, and possibly when it first shows up. So, the Tourette's would be there, but the stress and the trauma can kind of turn up the volume there, can amplify it, right? And when we go through periods of stress and trauma in life, again, it might kind of affect how much we tic, whether that's our vocal tics or our motor tics or our both. Childhood adversity, so essentially as childhood trauma, is linked to more severe tics in adulthood and is a dose response pattern. So it's linked to, not proven to cause, right? So they're intertwined, but we're not saying childhood trauma causes tics or causes Tourette's. However, when we start to think about functional tics and functional seizures, this is slightly different, because we know that there is a kind of stress and trauma are far more central to the cause, right? And it's really, we have to be very careful to hold this line between how trauma shapes tics, but it does not simply cause them. It's very easy to get this kind of misinformation out in the world. In Tourette's, the stress response. So when we think about kind of the stress system and the tic system and how they are the same system. So the Tourette's, in Tourette's, the stress response runs hot. The HPA axis is more reactive and cortisol responds more strongly. The stress response feeds the brain loop, and that kind of produces tics through dopamine. So stress literally turns up the volume, and it runs both ways. So stress can worsen tics, and tics widen the nervous system kind of react. The tic-wired nervous system can react harder to stress. And living with tics is going to be stressful. We've got the stigma, the being watched, the constant kind of effort of masking and suppressing. And then kind of especially when we think about kind of being a woman and what that also means. And it can build up a loop that we can kind of interrupt, but the lower the stress load, the tic severity genuinely eases, right? So when we're kind of working with tics and Tourette's, we want to be kind of lowering the kind of the stress load, and however which way that looks like. It's not a cure, but it's a lever. The nervous system that holds your trauma, the one that makes your tics, are the same kind of nervous system, right? So the takeaway is it just anxiety, or is it just trauma? That's a bit of a dismissal. It's not an explanation. It's your nervous system is really doing something real here. Okay, these are not imagined. And even when we kind of think about tics and kind of functional tics and functional seizures that might kind of be embedded with stress and trauma, it does not make them any less real, right? And I say that as someone who has kind of a lot of, I call them stress seizures. I used to have a lot, I still can have them. And one of the kind of really profound things for me is that I thought I was making them up. I thought, are these really real? And then when I started to track kind of my whoop for my exercise, you could actually see on my data when these things were occurring, and it was very clear that this was something that was actually happening in my body, and I could see the data of it, right? So going through kind of some of the things, if you're in Project You and you've been in Project You for a while, you've probably heard some of these things, but I still think it's important. So when we're thinking about how do we support our nervous system, sleep is a big one here. If you know me, I love sleep. Sleep is the best thing. Regular sleep schedule. So even on the weekends, that kind of regular time that we go to bed, regular time that we wake up. This is all about circadian rhythm, getting our body in a nice pattern, in a nice rhythm, right? Only using your bed for sleep and rest to train your brain. Create a sensory friendly environment. So blackout curtain, weighted blankets, or in this heat, cooling blanket. Although I never think they're actually cool enough. Like I feel like at some point, can someone just make an ice blanket for me? That's what I needed last week. Um, Light and melatonin regulation, so morning light is really important. It can kind of help boost the circadian rhythm. Sun, kind of, if you can't get the actual kind of light from the outside, especially like in winter, a sunrise alarm is really good. Limiting blue light screens from kind of 30 to 60 minutes before bed. I always go 60 minutes, and consider using something like blue light blocking glasses in the evening, and things that kind of can support calming brain chemistry in the evenings, things like GABA supportive foods. So green tea, I'd say green tea in the daytime, green tea kind of before 2 o'clock, because it does have a kind of high caffeine load into it as well. Fermented foods, spinach, nuts. I'm going to go into GABA supportive stuff in a moment as well. Oh, it's there anyway. Magnesium, B6, and L-theanine can also aid relaxation. L-theanine and GABA are very good friends. This is why a lot of sleep tablets, a lot of sleep supplements tend to have magnesium and L-theanine in there, kind of working together, right? Now, if you're in Project You, we do have a sleep webinar that we did last year called Rest Rewired. If you are watching this and you're not part of Project You, I'm going to speak to Leanne and we're going to figure out and get this onto the YouTube so you can have access to it as well. From a nutritional therapy perspective, hydration. Water is our friend. Water is our nervous system's friend, okay? To give you some simple math, I say simple math, 35 milliliters of water per kilogram of body weight, if you want to calculate how much that actually means for you. So it would be 30 milliliters per kilogram of your body weight is roughly your kind of daily amount of water needed. Other things that'd be really good for your nervous system: oily fish and omega-3 foods. So salmon, mackerel, anchovies, sardines, and herring. You're looking about kind of 2 to 3 portions a week. Chia seeds and flax seeds, you can grind them up, put them on your Greek yogurt and your fruits in the morning, right? Dark leafy veg, green, really good for you as well. So again, your kind of kale, your Swiss chard, your bok choy, your spinach, all of these kind of things help with B vitamins and vitamin K. So B vitamins in particular, and you have to remember with neurodivergent people, we can have some problems with B vitamins. So sometimes we actually also need B vitamins in a methylated form as well. So I'm always interested in what's going on for B12, B6, and B9. Because these things can really affect our nervous system. Words. So the dark leafy greens have good vitamin B, have a good vitamin K, and they're high in magnesium, potassium, and calcium, which again kind of helps to regulate the electrical impulses and prevents the kind of nerve cell from overstimulation. Well, helps to, maybe not all the way. If you work with me, I love a turmeric latte, okay? Turmeric latte, it can also be called, I think, gold milk, sorry. So turmeric's active compound is curcumin, and that crosses the blood-brain barrier to boost brain growth. Brain growth hormones are BDNF, and block neuroinflammation that damages brain cells, right? So if you're kind of watching, you're thinking, why does this woman always tell me to be drinking my turmeric lattes? We're looking at kind of neuroinflammation and reducing some of that neuroinflammation in your nervous system. Curcumin can also be the one if you take if you don't mind taking supplements. I'd always say with curcumin to kind of someone in the chat saying you're still not convinced me. I'm telling you, a little bit of cinnamon on the top, it's nice. You can even put a little bit of maple syrup in there just to sweeten the taste if you'd like to. Curcumin as a supplement can also work really well. I will say, if you have any issues with your liver and your detoxing, just be very careful with curcumin and kind of, again, work with a health practitioner there. Turmeric as well is a very powerful antioxidant, and it kind of neutralizes free radicals and regulates vital neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine for healthy nerve signaling, right? Additional bits that we can do is some Epsom salt bath. some diaphragmatic breathing. But I will say with any kind of breathing exercise, if you have tics or Tourette's, be careful. Or if you're working with someone with tics and Tourette's, be careful, because that kind of the breathing exercises can also trigger tics. And one of the tics it can kind of trigger is to almost stop breathing and to hold it in. So diaphragmatic breathing is really great for kind of a more generalized kind of support in the nervous system. However, be careful. Okay, be careful with yourself, be careful with who you're working with. Low intensity exercise again helps with the brain derived neurotropic factor. It supports neurogrowth and repairs nerve pathways without triggering a stress spike in adrenaline. So you're looking at kind of some zone. If you know me, I love zone 2. Okay, I love me some zone 2, right? Zone 2, chef's kiss. We also want to be kind of balancing blood sugar, because we want to prevent the sharp glucose crashes that signal a perceived emergency to the brain, which can otherwise trigger fight or flight response. And normally, if you're working with blood sugar, you're normally working with kind of cortisol as well. So when we reduce cortisol, we're kind of protecting the brain's hippocampus from chronic wear and tear, preserving your memory, learning capabilities, and emotional regulation. And some of the supplements that, again, I like, ashwagandha, it acts as an adaptogen to manage the stress response. When we say adaptogen, we think adapting the nervous system, adapting the immune system. While lion's mane is associated with stimulating nerve growth factor to support neuro pathways. Again, if you're not liking the turmeric lattes, you can actually, I think hybrid herbs do some kind of powders for lion's mane and ashwagandha, or kind of just they do like a complex and stuff like that. Put that in your coffee, put it in your hot chocolate, put it in your drink, put it in your smoothie. You know, again, it's a very easy way to get some of the goodness into your system to support your nervous system health. And again, L-theanine kind of pathway to kind of GABA. It's believed to cross the blood-brain barrier to boost calming alpha brain waves and support GABA receptors, reducing chemical signals that contribute to anxiety. And with ADHD, remember, we tend to have issues with GABA. So, I think we can be quite low. Is it low in GABA or high in GABA? I can't remember. Wow, it's definitely the evening time. Anyway, GABA is our friend. L-theanine is our friend. For those into the fitness world, James Smith has a good brand. I can't remember what it's called. It starts with an M. Nootropics. No, that's not it. Something like that. But he does his kind of sports drinks or his kind of sports brand, and a lot of them are really good for ADHD and kind of concentration and just calming down the mind a little bit. It's my go-to for the sports kind of drinks, especially if I want kind of caffeine in the gym, because I will use it as part of kind of focused fitness rather than having it throughout the day. Also for nighttime, who do I like to use? Again, I can't remember, but there are some good kind of supplements out there, good brands that again do some good L-theanine, magnesium, kind of ashwagandha all together for a good evening blend. Can't remember them off the top of my head. If you want me to tell you in the app or in the comments, just let me know. But again, as we end, it's really, 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 really important to understand that this is generic advice, right? This is just me giving you some education, right? Research yourself. Go and speak to your GP, speak to a healthcare provider. Don't try to treat yourself by yourself. Do it with someone, because every single one of you that are watching this, every single person that you work with is a different human being and needs to be thought about as a whole and holistic human being. And it's, you know, we have to kind of work in relation to health in a very kind of safe and appropriate way. So again, before taking any herbs or supplements, ensure that they have been checked for interactions against any medications you are on. If you're watching this and you're thinking, hey, why don't you give me that supplement, or why don't you do that? It's probably because I've checked them against medications that you're on, and there could be some interactions there as well. If you're in ProjectYOU and you want things checked, you can just let me know and I can go on my systems and check them. If you're not on ProjectYOU and you're watching this live, maybe you should come and work with us, because, you know, we got good systems in place. So if any of you are still watching live and you have questions, feel free to put it into the chat. I'm just going to do some spill, and once I've done my spill, I'm going to come back to the chat and turn off the recording and we can chat. So for those of you who are still here and are watching on YouTube, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about what we do at ProjectYOU. So ProjectYOU is or Project You Academy, sorry, is a neurodivergent specialist fitness and well-being business supporting neurodivergent women to reduce burnout, improve physical and mental health, and build sustainable routines that work with their brains. The organization combines fitness, lifestyle, and neurodivergent coaching to address gaps in traditional approaches designed for neurotypical clients and provides support unavailable or inaccessible via other methods. By redesigning coaching systems around executive function, energy regulation, and accessibility, ProjectYOU delivers high long-term well-being outcomes, making consistency finally attainable, and reduce stress, shame, and embarrassment that comes with looking after yourself as a neurodivergent person. If you would like to inquire about working with us, please reach out via our social media channels. And if you don't know what to say, you can just say the word inquiry, and we will message you back, taking you through the process together. And the Instagram, if you would like to find us, is ProjectYOU Academy. So this has been our June webinar. We do one a month. Follow us on the YouTube channel and get in contact if you are interested in working with us.